Our first presenter today is actually one of the co-founders of the Singularity Institute. He has a popular community blog called Less Wrong, which has over 2 million visits. He's currently working on a popular level book on rationality based on his writings on Less Wrong, and he's an artificial intelligence theorist, prolific writer about human rationality, and he's here to talk to us today. So please welcome Eliezer Yudkowsky to the stage.
Good morning. So I know you're all still groggy waking up, so I'd like to start out by asking you an extremely difficult moral question. You'll have to think hard about this one. The woman in the background of the slide has smallpox. Probably none of you have ever seen it in real life, I expect. It used to be terrifying, scourge of the world. My moral question is this. Are you for or against smallpox? This used to be a really controversial question. Back when Dr. Boylston was trying to introduce smallpox inoculation to Boston in 1721, it was said that smallpox is a judgment of God on the sins of the people, and to avert it is but to provoke him more. It was said that inoculation was an encroachment on the prerogatives of Jehovah, whose right it is to wound and smite. Nowadays, the equivalent of this is Zain Hashmi. He was born with a rather painful disease that requires painful continuing blood transfusion. His parents requested in 2001 to conceive a savior sibling who would be screened to ensure a perfect match for bone marrow donation. Britain's bureaucracy approved it in 2003. It was challenged by a group called Comment on Reproductive Ethics, or CORE. The case reached the House of Lords in 2005 and was allowed. Problem was that at that point, Zain Hashmi was 5 years old. He needed the transplant before he was 6. The mother had just turned 40. The embryo was, they found a good embryo. They implanted it. She miscarried. I haven't read in the news yet that he's dead. But on the whole, not a very good showing there. So why would this group Comment on Reproductive Ethics do something like that? The argument that they used was that there was a slippery slope. You let them tissue screen embryos, and the next thing you know, we've got cannibalism. They didn't actually say that. I'm not even sure they actually bothered describing where the slippery slope led. So for those of you who have heard about Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations, there's 5 sort of intuitive schemas that tend to underlie morality. They are harm and benefit, fairness, groups and loyalty to the group, authority and respect, and purity and contamination. And Jonathan Haidt doesn't actually say this because when you're a scientist, you're not supposed to sound quite this judgmental, but moral schemas based on purity and contamination tend to go really nasty, really fast. So if you've got to sort of defend, I'm not quite sure what it is I would describe them as defending, but you've got to defend its purity from even a tiny bit of contamination by allowing savior siblings. And they're willing to kill the kid for that. And I would just like to note that that is what I would call a slippery slope. Going forward, life extension, anti-agathics, doing basic research to resolve basic problems in aging is now a possibility, is now being debated. And here's what Leon Kass, who at the time was bioethics advisor to our thankfully former President George W. Bush, had to say about it. Perhaps mortality is not simply an evil. Perhaps it is even a blessing. Against my own strong love of life, and against my even stronger wish that no more of my loved ones should die, I aspire to speak truth to my desires by showing that the finitude of human life is a blessing for every human individual, whether he knows it or not. That translates into, I'm going to advise the president to ban anti-aging technology because I want you all to die. And, personally, I think he should have just gone with that love of life thing. I think it's one of those things you're just supposed to go with your love of life and your desire not to see your loved ones die. You're not actually supposed to be fighting that down. Leon Kass's orientation is basically religious, which means that he actually thinks everyone is already immortal. They're just not supposed to be immortal here. They're supposed to be immortal in heaven. Actually sort of find it somewhat amusing that you ask the same people and they will say simultaneously, what could you possibly do with eternity? And they will also claim to have immortal souls. And they will not realize that there is anything at all contradictory about these two claims, or about these two statements, I should say. If you ask secular humanists what they think of life extension, a lot of them will give back exactly the same replies as people who think they have immortal souls. Secular humanists will also go around saying things like, death gives meaning to life, which is another one of those things where if you actually think about it for 5 seconds, instead of just marveling at the beautiful sound that the words make, you realize, no, wait a minute, death does not give meaning to life. Life gives meanings to life. A beautiful sunset is every bit as pretty in that moment, whether you're going to die eventually or not. You don't sit there looking at a beautiful sunset saying, you know what makes this sunset meaningful? The fact that I will inevitably cease to exist. So why does all this happen? Why do we have humanists saying these sorts of things, even though they don't believe that they have souls? So the basic schema here is something called cognitive dissonance. And the notion is that if people were hit on the heads with baseball bats once every month, then soon philosophers or other people whose job it is to say wise-sounding things would discover all sorts of amazing benefits to being hit on the head with a baseball bat. To help you smile while you get hit. They would say that, getting hit on the bat once a month with a baseball bat toughens you. It makes you less afraid of lesser pains. It makes the bat-free days all the sweeter. Really, it's getting hit on the head with the bat once a month that gives meaning to life. But if you take someone who's currently not being hit on the head with a baseball bat, and you ask them if they'd like to start, in exchange for all these wonderful benefits, they'll say no. And it's exactly the same way with smallpox, aging, and, should we someday get so far as eliminating it, death. The reason why smallpox seems to us like such an obviously bad idea is that we don't have to live with it anymore. If it were still around, people would be making all sorts of excuses for it. And the problem is that when someone invents inoculation, or when they start introducing for the first time the prospect of doing basic research against aging, the excuses and rationalizations don't automatically go away. People really fooled themselves into thinking smallpox was part of the plan, that it was meant to be, and that if you tried to get rid of smallpox, you were interfering with the plan. And then in order to embrace inoculation, you have to stand up and say, you were wrong. You have to say it never was a judgment of Jehovah. If your child died of smallpox a decade back, you have to admit that that was actually pointless. There wasn't a higher purpose to it. It wasn't part of the plan. And that you could have prevented it as easily as sticking your child with a needle if you'd known what to put on the other end of the needle. So yesterday's cute little rationalization for something that no one can possibly do anything about to help us live with it and smile while we get hit on the head with a baseball bat is tomorrow's obstacle to progress. Same way with old age and death nowadays. We have to live with them now. People are making all sorts of excuses that sound clever, like it's really a blessing in disguise. That's one heck of a disguise. You could have fooled me. But if there was some planet where no one had ever heard of old age or death, and someone stood up and said, hey, I've got this brilliant idea. Let's wrinkle up like prunes, spend 20 years lying in bed, and cease to exist. It'll give meaning to life. try it. But just remember, for it to work, it has to be inevitable, and it has to happen to everyone whether they like it or not. So I think that the people on this planet would say no and then haul the person off to the mental asylum. And now that we're starting to debate whether to conquer old age, the same way we used to debate whether to conquer smallpox, is exactly the same schemas popping up. So I think the number one reason why people don't just go with their love of life is that it sounds too simple. There's a lovely little quote from this about evolutionary psychology. Is John Tooby in the audience? I think so. Hi, John Tooby. 99% of what Darwinian theory says about human behavior is so obviously true that we don't give Darwin credit for it. Ironically, psychoanalysis has it over Darwinism precisely because its predictions are so outlandish and its explanations are so counterintuitive. Freud's ideas are so intriguing that people are willing to pay for them, even though they never were experimentally tested in any way, and as far as we can now tell are all wrong. But, you know, if you say that all of your life problems come from being secretly in love with your mother, it may not be true, but at least sounds surprising enough that you can see why they would pay psychoanalysts to say that. You go to an evolutionary psychologist and ask them, well, what does evolutionary biology predict about the human mind, given that we know that it was designed by natural selection? And they'll say, well, people will like to have sex. And this is a unique prediction of the theory that the brain was designed by natural selection. But it still somehow just doesn't sound surprising enough that we give evolutionary psychology proper credit for it. And similarly, is death good? No. Who's going to pay you to sit around all day and be a professional bioethicist if your papers are that short? But there are some occasions in life where life does not have to be complicated. And this, I think, is one of them. You know, sometimes the obvious answer is actually right. If I ask you, what's 2 plus 2? You say 4. Then I ask you, but what does 2 plus 2 really, truly, ultimately equal? The answer is still 4. Still 4, even if I ask it in a deep, portentous tone of voice. Is life better than death? Yes. Is life really, truly, ultimately better than death? Yes. And this leads me to my proposal for what I call simplified humanism. You see, a lot of modern moral philosophers seem to have special clauses that come into play when you do something your ancestors didn't do, or when advanced technology is involved. So, for example, it's generally good to cure disease unless genes are involved, because genes are icky and scary. To illustrate the sort of thinking that I think is going into this, well, this story, you know, I heard it about a friend of a friend, so it may be totally untrue. Then again, it could be totally true. Either way, I find it amusing. And it's about someone who once went to a restaurant and was warned not to eat the tomato on their hamburger because the tomato has genes in it. Similarly, with the idea that it's great to be healthy and alive until you reach a certain age, at which point it is bad to use technology to prevent you from being sick and dead. It's actually like sort of better to be sick and dead once you hit, well, 80, unless you are 80, in which case the cutoff age is 85, or unless you're 85, in which case the cutoff age is 90 or something. Of which I like to say, I want to live one more day. Tomorrow, I will still want to live one more day. Therefore, I want to live forever, proof by induction on the positive integers. So my proposal is to simplify. You have a simplified version of humanism. The simplified version, you know, instead of saying curing disease is good unless genes are involved, you just say curing disease is good. Instead of saying life and health are better than death and sickness up to age 80, you just say life and health are better than death and sickness. Another key point of simplified humanism, personhood theory, says that fishes and chickens are non-people because they're differently brained, not because they're differently shaped. To illustrate why this is sort of non-obvious, I have a friend who says that when she was teaching an introductory philosophy class, she would ask the students, is Yoda, the little green guy from Star Wars, is Yoda a person? And often they would answer no, because to them human and person meant the same thing. So by way of making her point clear, I suggested to her that she ask her class, would you eat Yoda? And she tried that. And she said that one student said yes, they would eat Yoda because he's not human. And I said to her in reply, I begin to wonder if your students are people. So personhood theory isn't obvious to everyone, and back in the bad old days, it was a lot less obvious. The reason why the Enlightenment ended up on the correct side of the war against slavery was this notion that if someone can be sad and happy just like you, if they resent being enslaved just like you, if they experience life in the same way you do and don't want to be in chains any more than you would be, then their skin color shouldn't matter once we know these key facts about their minds. And that's why it's a bit alarming to hear someone say that they would eat Yoda. It shouldn't matter that his skin is green. And an important implication of this simplification, where we just take skin color out of the theory, you can generalize this notion of personhood theory a bit, because the key idea is that you pay attention to the mind. So you can change your shape and still be an object of moral value. You can be made of silicon instead of carbon and still be an object of moral value. It's the same sort of outlook that would tell you that Yoda is a person and valuable would tell you that Zain Hashmi's putative genetically engineered savior sibling, or probably genetically screened savior sibling, or genetically engineered, whatever, hasn't had her purity or her sanctity violated by that, unless it affects her mind somehow. So, simplified humanism. Life is better than death, not just when you're 30, all the time. Health is better than sickness, whether you're 10 years old or 100 years old or 1,000 years old. You know, we might not be able to figure out how to keep you healthy when you're 1,000 years old. Personally, I think that's pretty likely by the time we actually are 1,000 that we'll have the technology. But the key notion here is that simplified humanism is stating a value. It's saying, if you can have the technology, then it's good to use it. Happiness is better than pain. Ceteris paribus, all else being equal. Not saying we should all run out and smoke crack, but all else being equal, it's better to be happy than sad. I know, it's a strange idea. And while we're on the subject, knowledge is better than ignorance. It's not all that relevant. I was just making the list and felt that that belonged on the list somehow. And simplified humanism. Embrace the goal of success instead of making excuses for failure. Which brings me to the second part of my talk about positive futurism. So here's a beautiful piece of poetry. In the age when life on earth was full, they loved each other and did not know that this was love of neighbor. They deceived no one, yet they did not know that they were people to be trusted. They were reliable and did not know that this was good faith. They lived freely together, giving and taking, and did not know that they were generous. For this reason, their deeds have not been narrated. They made no history. So what is wrong with this? It's a beautiful sentiment, check. Uplifting, check. Virtuous, moral, check. Poetry, yep, good poetry. It's not true. Yes, that's right. It's factually false. There never actually was an age when life on Earth was like that. We know by now what hunter-gatherer tribes were like, or this is actually a picture of a rice paddy, but you know, the original Dawn Age was hunter-gatherer tribes. And different anthropologists have different estimates for how likely you were to die by violence in a hunter-gatherer tribe. The top estimate, 65% of the adult males die by violence. Lower estimate is 15% of the adult males die by violence. Steven Pinker likes to say that in the 20th century, 100 million people died by violence, which shows how far we've come. Because if the 20th century had been as violent as the good old days of hunter-gatherer tribes, 2 billion people would have died by violence during the 20th century. So this wonderful poetry here is not in fact true, which is always a good thing to keep track of. I mean, if this poetry were true, we'd just have to deal with it. But as a question of simple fact, this poetry is mistaken. So having settled this issue, which always comes first, the other problem with this poetry that ought to jump out at you is that it is oriented toward the past and is putting our best days behind us. David Brin once suggested that whether time slopes upward or downward is a key component of your cultural gestalt. Worldwide, most cultures believed in some lost golden age when people knew more, mused loftier thoughts, and were closer to the gods, but then fell from grace. Only a few societies ever dared to contradict this dogma of nostalgia. Our own scientific West, with its impudent notion of progress, brashly relocated any golden age to the future. So, the title of this talk is Positive Futurism. And you might guess that positive futurism is going to be futurism that says time slopes upward and our best days are still ahead. This, of course, is not allowed. Because before you can be a positive futurist, well, first you've got to take care of that question that always comes first: is it actually true? You are not allowed to decide questions of fact by being optimistic about them. And by way of introducing positive futurism, I'm going to talk a bit about rational futurism. Yes, you all knew I was going to work a lecture in here on rationality somehow. So, rationality-based constraints on futurism. Number one, what you want doesn't control how the world is. Moral beauty of progress doesn't get to dictate the laws of physics. Even if being alive is better than being dead, it may still be that if the universe lasts long enough, we will eventually run out of negentropy. You cannot run out of energy. Energy is conserved. When people talk about running out of energy, they're actually talking about running out of negentropy, but that is a whole long physics lecture I'm not going to get into. But the simplified humanism, again, it doesn't say that you can do this. It says that if you can live forever, then you probably should. And this is worth emphasizing because a lot of times if you talk about immortality, people will say, well, but what about the universe running down? Well, first of all, even if the universe runs down after a while, it is still better to live 1 billion years than to live 80 years. There's still a significant difference. And the other part of it is that you're talking about values first. First you decide your values. Then you, separately from that, figure out your facts. Then you decide, like, can you get the technology to do this? Rationality constraint number 2. There's no destiny that helps you. That's the other reason why you can't just say, well, I'm going to be a positive futurist and see time sloping upward. You know, there could be various events that are going to make time slope downward. And the laws of physics, which are what this universe actually runs on, are not going to check and see, did our positive destiny get violated by this event? They're just going to go on, you know, having quarks bump into quarks and so on. And of course, if a positive future really were inevitable, then we could all just relax and play video games and there wouldn't be any need for a Singularity Institute. So I guess in that sense, we are, you know, sort of biased when it comes to this business of claiming that, you know, there's no destiny involved. I think the usual saying is that causes alternate between declaring that victory is inevitable and declaring that victory will take a long, hard struggle, so we could just leave out the first part of that. Rationality constraint number 3. Magic doesn't work. Where by that I don't mean stage magic, like James Randi uses. I mean, you know, real magic, whereby real magic, if I had to define it, I guess I would say that it's sort of a mistaken outlook on the universe in which things are inherently mysterious rather than us just being confused about them. And you have ontologically basic, you know, sort of very high-level facts about, I wanted this to happen, so it happened, and it doesn't reduce to much simpler mathematical parts. So we probably mostly take for granted that magic doesn't work. It's worth noting because outside this hall, it tends to get overlooked a lot. You can't get an artificial intelligence by summoning a spirit into your computer. And the other reason why it's worth emphasizing that, yes, we know about this constraint, is that people who are making very quick judgments by pattern recognition instead of detailed analysis will often classify positive futurist ideas as magical. So they say, you want to transcend human limitations. That's magic. Or that is, they automatically classify it as magic because most of the people who talk about transcending human limitations are talking about using magic to do it. The thing is, though, that lots of people tried to fly by magical means before the Wright brothers built an airplane. So if you were around or if you were around before the age of, say, hot air balloons, and someone talked to you about flight, you might recognize flight as a magical idea that only wishful thinkers talk about. But what makes it magical is not the goal itself. The goal of flight, if you'd say, I want to fly, you're just stating a preference. What determines your rationality or irrationality is whether you try to fly by drinking potions or you try to fly by building a wind tunnel and experimenting with it until you can figure out how to build an airplane. So back in the good old days, being strong enough to tear apart mountains was a property of divine beings. Nowadays, it's a property of heavy machinery. Staying young at age 100. There's certainly a lot of people who are selling quack methods for that right now. If you start out by saying, well, I'd like to still be young at age 100, and then you do research on it, you're stating a value and choosing a rational means of working toward that value. But if you work by pattern recognition and association, then obviously talking about staying young at age 100 will feel very magical because it's currently talked about by people who talk about other magical things. Finally, you can't just make stuff up. By default, human beings just make stuff up. It's what the ancient Greek philosophers did. They just had no clue how stuff worked, so they go around saying things like, all is water, or all is fire. And they never asked themselves, wait a minute, even if everything was water, how on earth could I possibly know that? So an example of a violation of this rule, the International Congress on Forecasting in 1982, some cognitive psychologists showed up. They asked one group of professional forecasters for the probability of an earthquake in California causing a flood that kills at least 1,000 people sometime in 1983. They asked another group for the probability of a flood killing at least 1,000 people sometime in 1983. The first group assigned higher probabilities to the strictly more complex event. So the conjunction rule of probability theory is that the probability of A and B is always less than or equal to the probability of A whether or not B happens. And the conjunction fallacy is if you assign a probability to A and B, that's higher than the probability of A. And people commit this fallacy all the time because adding more detail can make a story sound more plausible, even as it becomes strictly less probable. And once you realize this, that every little detail you add onto your prediction is an extra burden that has to be separately lifted by evidence that is strong enough to support it, then you look at the futurists who you see on television, and you realize they are just making stuff up. They are making up lots and lots of details that create this wonderful, amazing story about the future. And that sort of futurism is a branch of the entertainment industry. Then you've got the futurists who, for every little detail that they tack onto their story, they ask, can I justify that particular detail? What do I think I know, and how do I think I know it? And this sort of futurism looks completely distinct from the other sort. It's also very rare. To name one sort of person outside the Singularity Institute who does this, Nick Bostrom at the Oxford Future of Humanity Institute. It does tend to be a bit more academic. And once you know what the conjunction fallacy is, you can just sort of really quickly eyeball the futurist and say, is this person telling a story or are they doing an analysis? So the positive in positive futurism cannot possibly mean foretelling a golden age because all of your predictions are strictly questions of fact. They either come true or they don't. And your values and your optimism get nothing whatsoever to say about that. On the other hand, there comes a point where you have to make policy choices, where your beliefs of fact tell you what happens if I do this, what happens if I do that, and you pick the policy that your values say has the best consequences. So positive futurism is about positive goals rather than positive predictions. And, well, for example, people often come to us and they expect us to agree with the idea that change is accelerating exponentially. I'm sort of neutral, leaning towards skeptic on that. Michael Vassar, our president, is a skeptic. Peter Thiel, our major funder, is a definite skeptic. People often expect us to agree with the accelerating change idea because it sounds like a positive thing to say about technology, and they expect us to agree with anything positive that anyone says about technology. But if accelerating change were true, it would just be a sort of background fact. And then the question would be, okay, taking this background fact into account, what policy choices do we make? Stephen Case identified 4 attitudes toward technology. Technophile, technology is good. Technophobe, technology is bad. Techno-normal, nothing really good or nothing really bad is going to happen. Things will just go on as they, life will carry on. And techno-volatile, the future might be extremely good or extremely bad, but it's not likely to end up anywhere in between. The main one of these attitudes that strikes me as completely unreasonable is techno-normality. There's all sorts of extreme forces coming onto the game board that weren't there before, and to expect them to all fail or exactly cancel out for the purpose of making the outcome normal would just be really, would be one heck of a coincidence. Now, there's one argument for techno-normality that says, we've heard these predictions before, and life has gone on. But suppose I were to tell you that, 100 years in the future, we'll have gone back to horses instead of cars, kings instead of democracies, and books being too expensive to own. Well, that is what life used to be like. And if it went back to that, we would call it a catastrophe. So how is this not a golden age? Life did not go on as normal. We look back in time, and what we see is that history has gotten steadily more normal. For example, women used to be unable to vote. This was very odd. Now they can vote. That's normal. So you can see that the trend is toward greater and greater normality over time. But if you imagine how incredibly odd it would be to live in the 19th century, well, the future is probably at least that odd. And if you imagine how odd it would be, how odd life was before humans were around, well, since some of the forces that are coming onto the game board are changing the constituency of intelligent life that is no longer within the tiny little cluster, the tiny little dot where all modern humans live, we can expect life to be at least that strange as well. A lot of techno-normal advocates actually say that all this talk of golden age and catastrophe is childish, to which I can only say that the laws of physics have not been written in such a way that they check whether something is childish before it is allowed to happen. They are offering literary critiques of things that are meant as predictions rather than as literature. They are saying that extreme futures are bad poetry. And even if that were true, it would not make a difference. So the Singularity Institute is techno-volatile. Peter Thiel is techno-volatile. Nick Bostrom is techno-volatile. I'd actually be sort of hard put to think of any careful thinkers who are not techno-volatile, with the possible exception of Robin Hanson. So if that's what we say, can we claim to be the heirs of the Enlightenment, which is what this talk has really been about? There was this thing called the Enlightenment. It was first in favor of rationality, of making things better for everyone, of progress, of not making as many excuses anymore. Sir Francis Bacon, one of the first advocates of the experimental method, wrote a work of utopian literature called The New Atlantis, in which he said, "The end of our foundation is the knowledge of causes and the secret motion of things, and the enlarging of the bounds of human empire to the effecting of all things possible." Reasonably optimistic. You can contrast it, say, to someone who is not the heir of the Enlightenment. Bill McKibben wrote a book called Enough. You can't stop progress, but that's not true. We could choose to mature. That could be the new trick we share with each other, a trick as revolutionary as fire, or even the computer. They'll lead us bit by bit toward the revolutionary idea that we've grown about as powerful as it's wise to grow. And this is the sort of thing that makes David Brin foam at the mouth, because this is not a revolutionary new idea. This is the idea that is around as old as fire. All societies used to think like that until the Enlightenment came along. Not quite strictly true, but by and large, that was the way most people thought. So, which side is the Singularity Institute on? We occasionally go around talking about how AI could go wrong. We even say things like, the vast majority of possible minds in mind design space are not friends with you, and it will actually take very careful design and precise targeting to get an AI that will not go wrong. That sounds a bit pessimistic. And the argument I would make is that as long as you are still playing for very large positive stakes, you can still claim to be the heir of Sir Francis Bacon and the heir of the Enlightenment. See, this is what I don't think Bill McKibben has, or what people who are only trying to stave off ecological collapse and whose vision of a better future is that we all live happily ever after with sustainable technologies. They don't have a vision of how to get there from here. And as long as you're still trying to get to a kinder, happier intergalactic civilization, you might just be an heir of the Enlightenment. So, the new Atlantis, simplified humanism. Life is good, death is bad, personhood is cognitive, not everything valuable is human. You obey the same rationality constraints as any other person in any other problem when you're thinking about questions of fact, like what happens if we do this is always a question of fact. And positive futurism, climbing upward with or without a natural slope. It's not about being an optimist. It's about having positive goals and still playing for very positive outcomes as a stake on the board. And that is which I believe is the new Enlightenment. Thank you.
Ready to rock? Yeah. I think you got time for one question. Anyone want to ask one question? Anyone at all? That guy. I like it.
Thanks for your great talk. Reminded me a little bit of Michael yesterday, Vasser. I have a question about the values. So because you make a bold statement in terms of absolute statements that happiness is good and life is good. But what are your thoughts if you look at Aldous Huxley, Brave New World? So if you only have great positive values, it's not scarce anymore, so it doesn't mean anything to people. So I do believe personally that that death or pain is good to a certain extent, as it defines the other part of the spectrum. So what is your view on that? Thanks.
Did you have to ask a question that complicated? So I cannot resist mentioning my short story, Three Worlds Collide, which you are welcome to Google. So my general stance over there is that while there probably does come a point where by making people artificially happy at all times, under all circumstances, regardless of how the external world looks, and taking all the interesting challenge out of life by eliminating variance in affect and so on, you can certainly push it too far. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World I don't want to reason from because of something I call the logical fallacy of generalization from fictional evidence. It never actually happened. But if you ask me to pass a value judgment on that world, I would say that they could have done better. And I think that if you look at today's world, we could actually push the level of happiness up by quite a bit before we started running into trouble.
Thank you, Eliezer. Eliezer Yudkowsky, everyone.